Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the DEI session for the APS C&M user meeting today. We have Dr. Kristen Leash, Forbes D&I Trailblazer and co-founder and co-CEO at Title Equality, and Dr. Sonali Mahapatro, sorry if I messed that up, Quantum Innovation Sector Lead at the National Quantum Computing Center, Director of the Prospero Space Fellowship, and founding member and chair of New Voices in Space Working Group on the Scottish Space Leadership Council. They're going to discuss the power of small disturbances, the promise of domino dynamics, and how to innovate for a more equitable future. Would you like to take it away, Kristen or Sonali?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction. As you mentioned, we're talking today about the power of small disturbances, the promise of domino dynamics, and how to innovate for a more equitable future. I'm going to kick off the session today and speak for only a very short amount of time, and then I'm going to bring Dr. Mohapatra Sonali back for a conversation, a Q&A for her to share her perspectives with you. She really is my honored guest today, and I'm so excited to have her presenting here with me. But before I get much further, I just want to let you know a little bit more about Title Equality. As I mentioned, I'm Kristen, co-founder and co-CEO at Title Equality. And together with our small but mighty team, we care deeply about seeing our world, our nations, our communities, our organizations becoming places where everyone has an opportunity to succeed and reach their full potential. But I'm also a really impatient person, a very frustrated person who looks around at the pace of change, and I'm not happy with what I see. And so I show up every day trying to help people like you, organizations like the ones you represent, make lasting, meaningful change faster. But I also want to acknowledge that I'm zooming in today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and WSÁNEĆ peoples. It is unceded territory, and their relationship with the land continues to this day. My city is otherwise known as Victoria, British Columbia, and I encourage you to learn more about the territories on which you live, work, and play. Now, has anyone here ever heard of Ed Roberts? Ed grew up near San Francisco in the 1950s. He was the oldest of 4 boys, really athletic. He loved to play baseball, and the world was his oyster. Despite his white picket fence childhood, Ed was living in a time when systemic inequities were pretty stark. There was deep racial segregation, gender inequality, and a legal system that criminalized same-sex relationships, for example. But the inequitable systems that Ed lived inside, they didn't really seem to impact him until they did. When Ed was 14, he contracted polio, and he was paralyzed from the neck down. From that point on, Ed became painfully aware of the inequitable systems that he'd been living inside all along, because those systems began not only to fail him, but to actively and purposely prevent him from participating equally in the world around him. Despite his significant physical challenges, though, Ed finished high school. But when he did, a school administrator tried to deny him his diploma because he hadn't completed credits in phys ed or driver training. Later, when he applied to UC Berkeley, he faced resistance. One dean's opinion there at the time was that, quote, "We've tried cripples before and it didn't work." Despite these challenges, Ed persevered. He advocated for himself and others, and he kept pushing his way through systems that didn't account for him, that didn't want him, that weren't designed for him. Now, we all live and work inside systems, education systems, healthcare systems, financial systems, judicial systems, food systems, transportation systems, workplace systems, you name it. Systems run our world. They are meant to create order, stability, predictability. But the fact is, all these systems produce better or worse results for people. People like Ed, people like you, people like me, depending on so many variables that have very little relevance to those systems. take a moment to look at the people sitting in these 1x2 boxes on your screen. Everyone in this Zoom room will experience systems differently, depending on a lot of variables that very few, if not none of us, have any control over. Variables like race, gender, identity, sexuality, age, and so on. And there are so many more dimensions of diversity and variables that shape our lives and how we experience the world. I'm going to share my screen again here in a moment. Forgive me. There we go. Now, for example, women on this call, we're 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed after having a heart attack than men. And we're therefore more likely to die of a heart attack than men. Those of us of color on this call, a 2021 study found that 58% of people from predominantly Black neighborhoods in the US had detectable levels of lead in their blood, compared to 49% of people in mostly white neighborhoods. When it comes to age diversity, anyone here over 50 who gets laid off is substantially more likely than those in their 30s or 40s to remain unemployed for a longer period of time. And when reemployed, they are more likely to land a poorer subsequent quality job than if they're 30-year-old or 40-year-old colleagues. I could go on. The point is, humans, we don't experience an equal opportunity to thrive, succeed, or reach our full potential. That wasn't the case when Ed was a kid, and it's still not the case today. But we can do something about it. There's something else I want to tell you about Ed. I shared how he'd overcome some personal challenges along his journey, and it's true he did, but he did something else too. He made a small disturbance, a change to a system that was having an inequitable impact on his life. See, while Ed worked hard to live a life that fulfilled him, he still had to contend with a challenge that was very difficult to overcome. Those were the Berkeley streets, the system of streets in Berkeley, and the sidewalk curbs in particular. He said, if you're trying to get across the street and there are no curb cuts, 6 inches might as well be Mount Everest. So what did Ed do about it? I love this story. Famously, he organized to have this system hacked, literally. Ed, together with a group of allies and wheelchair attendants that were called the Rolling Quads, they went into the streets of Berkeley under the cover of dark, armed with sledgehammers and bags of concrete, and they created curb cuts. They conquered those many mini Everests that they battled every day. Then they lobbied the city to introduce curb cuts at all major intersections. They introduced a small disturbance to a complex system. They made a change, an innovation, an equitable innovation. And it was a change that made Berkeley streets more accessible to people like Ed, but that change also made Berkeley's streets just plain better for all. Now, this curb cut equitable innovation, it's an example of a change to a physical system, but every system is ripe for change, for transformation, so that it doesn't matter where you're born, what color your skin is, what God you worship, what country you come from, how much money you have, what your gender is, what shape your body is, or what your body can or can't do. Everyone should have an equal opportunity to succeed and reach their full potential without inequities in our systems holding them back. But I'm forgetting myself. I'm not here talking to social historians or civil infrastructure aficionados, although some of you may also identify with those interests. I'm talking to scientists. As scientists, you know a lot about systems, and you think inside of systemic frameworks and systemic processes all the time. I mean, when you applied to your undergrad institution many or a few years ago, you filled out paperwork, you were subject to criteria, and you were admitted. Similarly, when you applied to grad school, you went through a process where you were subject again to criteria and you were admitted. Nowadays, you participate likely in grant application processes. Your academic papers are subject to review and criteria sets. Heck, if you want access to the Hubble telescope, you follow an application process. But evidence shows these systems, like all systems, actually treat each one of you differently depending on some of those variables I mentioned a few minutes ago. So, for example, here we go. Those of you who identify as women likely face or faced at another point in your trajectory gender bias and discrimination. For example, if you applied for a lab manager position, recent research from Yale had scientists presented with application materials from a hypothetical student applying for a lab manager position and who intended to go on to graduate school. Half the scientist applications were given a male name and half were given the exact same application, but with a female name attached. Results found that the female applicants were rated significantly lower than the male applicants in competence, hireability, and whether the scientist would be willing to mentor the student. The scientists who were evaluating these applications also offered lower starting salaries to the female applicants, $26,507 compared to $30,000. If you started and completed your undergrad with a STEM major and you're Black or Latino or Latina, you were also less likely to do so than your white classmates. Another study used federal data from the National Center for Ed Statistics, and they looked at more than 5,600 Black, Latino, and white students who enrolled in college for the first time in the 2003-2004 academic year. Now, the data included students enrolled in four-year institutions and those who began in two-year colleges and transferred to four-year schools. Now, 19% of the white students declared as STEM majors compared with 20% of Latino and 18% of Black. In other words, they generally started enrolled at the same percentages. Yet, Black and Latino or Latina students changed majors at much higher rates than their white peers. About 37% of Latino and 40% of Black STEM students switched majors as undergrads compared with only 29% of white students. But just like the system of streets in Berkeley, the systems that create these kinds of inequities, they can be changed. Small disturbances in those systems can lead to seismic impact. A tidal wave, if you will, after all, starts with a small disturbance from below, but it's one that can change the landscape. One example of a small disturbance making a big impact on the equity of a system is, well, it's this one I'm not even going to give away. You're going to have to attend tomorrow's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion workshop to hear about that one. You'll hear about an equitable innovation that you should absolutely know about and one that should be widely adopted across systems of all kinds. So don't miss the DEI session tomorrow. And in a moment, my co-presenter, Sonali, is going to talk about other examples of small disturbances that can have an equitable systemic impact on the systems that they're in. But the fact is, small changes in systems like curb cuts, like other changes that we'll discuss in a moment, can create disproportionate effects. And that's not an opinion. It's something described more academically as domino dynamics, not to be confused with domino effects. Domino dynamics are when we see a non-linear change that starts in one part of a system and spreads to another. Cause and effect in this case do not need to be proportionate. Instead, a small disturbance in the right place can catalyze a massive reaction in a system and transform it into a new state. But How do you know where to make change and what change to make? Given where you sit in your organization, in your institution, where do you get started? The first should come naturally to you as scientists. Get curious. Get curious about how the people around you experience the systems that you're all a part of. Listen to them. Learn from their experiences. See what you can change. This is all the more important if you're a bit skeptical that the system needs to change in the first place. Chances are, for example, in the case of Berkeley, the engineers and city planners, they didn't deliberately design curbs that would present a Mount Everest style challenge to people in wheelchairs. Their sidewalk design, it was done through the lens of their own lived experience. And that likely didn't include any accessibility challenges. So if you personally don't feel like you're bumping up against any curbs, that doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means you're stepping over them without perhaps noticing. So listen to and learn from the people who have lived experiences of challenges and inequitable outcomes in the systems you're a part of, and work together to co-create the right small changes. Experiment, change a variable here or there. It's not rocket scientists, or rocket science rather. I'm looking at a rocket scientist, so I'm distracted by that. Now, I've really just wanted to give you a small taste for how small changes to systems can have a big impact. And I've connected the ideas here and there to your lives and work, but I'm now going to turn the spotlight on someone you're a lot more likely to consider a peer. My PhD, after all, is in English literature. So let me introduce you to Dr. Sonali Mohapatra. As we introduced at the beginning, she's Quantum Innovation Sector Lead at the National Quantum Computing Center, Director of the Prospero Space Fellowship, and founding member and chair of New Voices in Space Working Group on the Scottish Space Leadership Council. She, though, is also a poet. So there's that little tidbit as well. So I'm going to invite you to come off of mute and activate your camera, and I can see you there. I'm seeing just now the notes in the chat, and I appreciate a lot of that feedback there, and in particular, some that I will anticipate including in my next version of this session. So thank you. That's very much welcome. So Sonali, before I dive into questions for you, do you have anything else by way of a personal introduction that you'd make before we get started?
Yeah, I think I did my PhD in particle physics and quantum gravity, though in a parallel life, I would have wanted to do an English lit PhD, maybe in the future. Yeah, and I think so I have worked in the DEI space, especially in the UK, and we're chatting with Anna and Kristen before, and in Canada when I was there at Perimeter Institute, on and off for the last 10 years. A lot of it is obviously shaped by my own experiences and others' lived experiences, and a lot of it is by evidence collection, evidence gathering, understanding how different systems are connected together. They are a lot of research, a lot of work that goes into a lot of publications that happen every year. Thousands of publications come out with data on how we interpret these things. So I would encourage everyone to go and look up as much things as possible. But just to say that we are building up the evidence base. And before a few years, I would have said, yes, very much focus on an evidence-based strategy development plan. But I think given that we also lack a lot of evidence just because not everyone has the same lived experience, and again, which kind of research gets funded, again, has the same systemic bias that we live inside. I think it's very important to question everything and give more importance to lived experience until and unless we are have leveled the ground out.
Thank you so much for adding a nice touch of personal flair there, Sonali. So my first question, again, is a little bit personal. Why do you personally want to see innovation in the systems that are in the field of science for greater equity and inclusion?
Well, the very simple answer is I think we have been stupid for a long time. We have been leaving out 51% of our workforce out of the work scenario and trying to keep them in boxes. And this is just when we are talking about women, and they're not even the minority. And anybody, in a statistical field, anybody who deals with numbers will tell you this is stupid, because the more diversity, the more kind of ideas we want to generate. After all, science is an ideas game. It's a research game. How much knowledge we can share within each other. How can we stand on the back of giants and build upon the knowledge that already exists? So I think we've done a great job in kind of erasing a lot of the knowledge that we could have captured. I think now it's time to go back and be a bit smarter. We are at the age, it's a volatile age. We have so many different things that are coming up, climate change, different kind of national security concerns or international security concerns. We have food and global health concerns. We have an aging population, and we have overpopulation at the same time. And also we're also living in an era where we have very disruptive technology. We have generative AI such as ChatGPT and other large language models. I work in the National Quantum Computing Center, where we are developing quantum computers, and we are trying to understand how can we use quantum computers to solve actual challenges that will deliver benefit for society, starting from looking at bed allocation for patients in hospitals to theater allocation, very, very simple and boring sounding use cases, to how can we use quantum computers to take advantage of their large and parallel processing powers for complicated problems such as space debris calculations. We're also coming up in the cycle of bigger events, such as there might be a solar space weather event that might take down a lot of our power grids, for example. In the last 5 years, I used to work in the space sector, where I designed one of the first quantum key distribution cybersecurity systems for small satellites in the UK, and we also shipped one of them with the Canadian Space Agency. So there's lots of disruptive technology out there, lots of people trying to do lots of innovative stuff. And innovation will be better when we take everyone together. The resilience of a community is much better when we are diverse. If the majority's idea fails, then we need that 1% of people with a very out-of-the-box ideas to come in and save us at that moment. That is why I also feel diversity and inclusion, and just understanding that each of these problems are not per se an individual problem. It is a bigger structure that we are all in, but we do have some control over that structure in the way we interact with various different systems and various different people. We also have a sphere of influence around ourselves. And in terms of real life, I myself have been a physics PhD student, obviously. I have seen dramatically how the lunch table conversations change when there's 50% women on the team and when there's 10% women on the team. It makes it really difficult for certain topics to start raising up if things are not equitable. And then that, when I was a new PhD student and I came in, and I got used to having 50% women on the table for the first 2 weeks, and I was actually really refreshed to see the kind of discussions that we're having. It was very, very different kind of topics. And I think everyone felt welcome, and even the men on the table felt like they could go out of their boundaries, out of their defined boundaries, and talk about cross-dimensional topics. But when that suddenly dropped back off again, I started feeling really nervous about bringing a certain types of topics on the table. And then you start, if you're one woman on the table, you start getting known as, oh, why don't you take up the feminist topic? And I'm just like, maybe we should all be taking up these topics, since they matter to all of us, or they should be mattering to all of us. But I also really like this quote I read somewhere. What is the advantage that feminism and systems of EDI, or just the knowledge of how systemic EDI can work to improve our lives, has given to people other than vulnerable demographics? It's actually made people aware of the boundaries of the patriarchal system and has allowed them an opinion beyond it. It has allowed them to experience or search for that experience outside of the boundary of a patriarchal system. And we can actually be brave enough to go out and start looking at problems or solutions to solve all of these bigger problems that we have today. They're all connected. So yeah, I feel very passionately about this as a physicist, as a scientist, and as an innovator. I need for the rockets not to fail, because at least we have different kinds of people working on it. And I need for quantum computers to start solving problems. And in order to build them, we need very, very different kinds of brains thinking very, very different ways. and all neurons firing in very different directions.
I love that. And that absolutely was a passionate response, and I love it. And you touched on a couple of things there I want to draw everyone's attention to. One was that often we think of these issues, concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a very personal manner. You know, there are programs like unconscious bias training where individuals are challenged to uncover their own personal implicit biases. And we also have social discourse very much around, you know, certain groups and individuals needing to expand their worldviews or become aware of different types of oppression in experienced by groups around them. But you mentioned that, you know, this is a broader systemic issue as well, and that each person does exist in their own sphere of influence. Some wield more influence on the world and systems around them, and maybe the levers that they have to pull can have a significant impact. And we might in that case think of people who experience more systemic advantage, or they can be people in positions of power, officially leadership positions, but that we all do at the end of the day make decisions that either perpetuate the systems we're a part of, or we can throw a wrench in the works. But returning to this concept of systems, you know, you and I, when we had an earlier conversation, you mentioned that this systems-based thinking, whether it's in regards to bias and inequality and discrimination, systems-based thinking already aligns with the fields of science. How can you describe that a little bit more for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I wrote an article on this, on systems thinking in the space sector and how we can use DEI using the same kind of thinking. So I'm a systems thinker. I really encourage everyone to go and do maybe a certificate or a course on systems thinking, because it provides us the tools of mapping out how different systems interact with each other. Obviously, with physicists, we are very much aware of how different systems can, you know, even a small change to a chaotic system can lead to a very different outcome at the end. We are very aware of systems interacting in different ways. We haven't yet solved the three-body problem. We know how complicated that can get, and we are now trying to solve, you know, making of multi-qubit quantum computers, which is a really big challenge. But yes, so in the space sector, we use systems engineers are very much in demand in large system integrators such as BAE or Airbus or Lockheed Martin, or, you know, some of these bigger companies, they have thousands of systems engineers. In the startup that I was working at, we had almost everyone had a bit of a systems knowledge, because we needed to understand, we needed to work across the team to build a system really well. So we had a main systems engineer who was looking at how the different parts of the satellite are going to work together. I was leading the development of the instrument, and I was leading the development of one part of the entire prototype that's going to go into the satellite. My colleague was working on another different part, and we had to test every single interaction between the different systems. And we're all used to these kind of testings. But the theory and knowledge behind how we visualize systems is very much embedded into the space industry. We are very much used to working within it. But another big field where systems thinking is very regularly used is intersectional feminism. It has been used since a long time. You can look at research on systems thinking and intersectional feminism. We don't really have to invent the wheel. But I think what has always stuck with me is that even as a physics student or as a space engineer, we tend to think very logically in a systems thinking way about the problem that we're trying to solve professionally. But it's very easy to forget that we can actually use this knowledge that we have gained in every sphere of our existence. We can, if once we start thinking about, I'll just give a simple example. So many of you might have read Invisible Women and a few other books, and a lot of statistical knowledge is coming out, a lot of statistical research is coming out on how much there is a bias in the architecture of our worlds against vulnerable demographics, such as women, just as an example. So let's imagine we have phones, we have really big phones. And it has been shown that most of the phone sizes are, again, built for an average male body and hand size. So let's imagine I'm I'm coming to work and I have a big phone in one of my hands. I have another coffee mug, which is again designed for an average man's hands. And I need to go through a subway by putting a ticket. And I can't do it very easily as much as an average man could be doing. Average man is the key word here, because there's a lot of men who would have a similar kind of handspan as me. And again, they would be in a similar kind of situation as me. Now, I live in the UK, so we have this huge big doors which were built before, again, when the workforce was predominantly male. So you go in and you're trying to push in the door, and I actually have fibromyalgia, so it's a condition where I have widespread pain in my body. At some point, I could not use my hands for 3 months, and I was very much disabled. And now I have to continuously make sure that I do physio to make sure that the pain is down. So when I'm trying to push open that door and I'm already injuring myself in that moment, just walking into the office, that puts me in a vulnerable state of mind, because you're already panicked about, okay, this part is hurting again. And then because you're of a vulnerable demographic, and because you might not be able, there is a power difference between how different cultural people talk to each other. So let's say that I have a boss who does not understand that different kind of cultures react differently, that my politeness is just politeness, not submissiveness. And that makes me more vulnerable to microaggressions. And at the same time, when I have already injured myself and I have dropped my phone and I have cracked the screen of it, then I'm already in a much more vulnerable mindset. And that makes me not be able to stand up on the spot and defend what I'm doing. Another example is temperatures, office temperatures. Office temperatures were set in 1968, according to an average male body average temperature. And obviously, we're all used to these questions over the last 30 years or so. First, they said, "Oh, can women do physics? Are women's brains adaptable to doing physics?" No, first they said, "Can we do high school maths?" So now women very regularly outperform males in high school. Then they brought the topic about to ask, can women do undergraduate? Maybe they cannot. Maybe their brains are too delicate to handle that. Now women are again outperforming very regularly men in undergraduate courses. And the next question they say, can women do higher education and degree-based education? So you can see how the goalposts are continuing to change. The other thing that I found out is that when people have actually done a lot of work trying to come up with answers to these kind of questions, baseless questions, but somebody asked those questions and we felt like we had to give an answer. So it has been found that when you're setting both men and women a maths test, and they're sitting in a room where the temperature is set to a particular kind of average male temperature that we know about, and then with every single degree temperature rise in the temperature of that room, it made women perform cognitively better. So not only is that question already kind of extremely biased in a way, we're not really asking about whether other genders are capable of doing physics or not. We're only asking for a particular gender just because of a bias. We're also, even with the testing that we did, we are again biased because we have set our temperature to a temperature which is not suitable to the way a female brain works, for example. And so there are multiple different, these kind of systemic connections to very, very small things. It has been shown that women are more vulnerable to substance abuse and to alcoholism and so on, and when they are under microaggressions as well. So let's imagine that, we have a very, I hesitate to say this, but I know that there's a lot of problems of just management, that relationship between PhD supervisors and PhD students can be very fraught with a lot of different kinds of tensions. And often it leads to very different kinds of microaggressions, to different kinds of backgrounds that people bring in. Let's imagine that a woman who has to do a lot of emotional labor at home and basically keep everything in her mind. Again, fertility treatment for women around the age of 30, let's say, is crazy high. And it's not going to be easy to cover that on a postdoc salary. So if you are pushing that backwards, then there is a problem for people who want to have a family. For other people who might not want to have a family, it's a different kind of ballgame, but you have to choose, it almost seems, at some point. And at the same time, that is the same time when getting a tenured position or starting on your first position, which can lead to a tenured position, is an important step of your life, similar kind of age cycles. And so there is a very inherent merit, the definition of merit problem here. How do we bring in the merit question when our starting points are very different, when our lived experiences are very different, when we have sometimes we have to take out time from work, not because we want to, but because there is an expectation of women to be the care worker in most of our world settings. Now imagine that we have a woman who is doing her PhD, at the same time she's raising 2 children, at the same time she's probably doing a lot of care work, much more than her partner if they're heterosexual and he is a heterosexual man. So that makes her much more vulnerable to questions like, where were you? What were you doing? Why do you have to go out of the meeting to take a call? Why is your baby crying? All of these are a lot of personal questions that take a lot of energy out. Even thinking about how this is going to affect you in the next 2 or 3 months is, very apparent to someone like me, because I can imagine that as a lived experience. If you cannot imagine that as a lived experience, it's a little bit difficult. And so these communications are really important. These lunch table discussions are really important. And that is exactly why we need to have a very, very good distribution of different kind of people looking differently, thinking differently, behaving differently. We need to have men who range from the very, very extroverted to the very introverted, neurodivergent to neurotypical. We need to have women who look as angry or as sweet on the both different ends. And we need to have women who feel completely free to come to work in heels, men who feel completely free to come to work in heels, and women and men who do not, who want to have a very professional image. It is very important because what we are producing, what we are teaching, even the way our school books, our textbooks are oriented. For example, we have seen pictures of Einstein everywhere. Well, we haven't seen pictures of Emmy Noether. I mean, embarrassingly, I didn't know Emmy Noether was a woman. And I did an undergraduate physics degree, never saw a picture of that woman. And I only came to know after my degree when someone said she, and I looked it up. And for 4 years, I did not know that. And I also fell into the same kind of trap because you hear this all over the world in your undergraduate degree, in your master's degree, in casual jokes that what women sometimes do as research is kind of fluffy. It does seem very backward right now, but it still exists. And when I was in the first year of undergrad and second year of undergrad, I fell into the same kind of trap. And I actually realized that I was not looking up as many female professors to apply to during my master's as I did with male professors. But once I started looking, I found thousands of them, right? And so this is a cycle. When you do not look, you're not going to apply. Then it's going to feed into that cycle of female professors not getting enough quality students. And then that would lead to a less publication counts from the labs. So it is a vicious cycle. We all have to fight against it. And we must remember that we're not just doing it to be decent, even though that's a good enough reason. We're also doing it to make sure that our futures are going to be better than our past were, all of our futures, because at some point somebody else is going to look at us and think that we are different from them, and so we do not bring the same kind of skills to the table. The world is changing. People will look at men the same way as women very soon, and we have to remember that we need to keep this decency within us, understand that we need to make space for others to come in after we have opened the door. So hold the door open for them. I hope that I completed the web of all the thoughts that I was trying to bring in here. Sometimes the webs get left open-ended, but I'm sure you can complete them.
No, that was really helpful, Sonali. And what I really heard you pointing out was, for example, whether we were talking about the design of cell phone sizes or the temperature in offices, once upon a time, these decisions were made by people for an ideal worker or an ideal standard client or customer or recipient, or you name it. And so the system grew all around that. And the same situation has occurred in our financial systems, our justice systems, in our workplace systems, where, you can imagine once upon a time, a group of people sitting around a table making decisions that would form that system. And they likely did not have a diverse set of voices in forming that design. And now fast forward to today, we've inherited those systems. We live inside them. And The people who most resemble those once upon a time decision makers are most likely to benefit from the system as it carries on, and those who don't. But that presents an opportunity for all of us to get curious about how that system can be optimized to provide the best results for all people involved. And like curb cuts can, in many cases, make the systems better for all. I know we talked once about carers, those with parenting responsibilities, and how even providing a parking space close to a lab or a building can be helpful to those who are carting around children when they come back to the office or to the lab. And that is to the benefit of both of parents of all genders. And and so that's an effect, a small change that can level the field. Now, I'm cognizant of time. We want to save some time for questions at the end. So Sonali, I'm going to ask you one more question, and we'll try to keep the answer to about 5 minutes if you can. And that's around the question of experimentation. When we talk about DEI interventions and things that can make the world more equitable, we're often looking for a research-backed solution. And in many cases, that's a good way to start. But the fact is, we have not solved these problems. There are no real solid gold standards. So how do you see experimentation, trial and error playing a role in how we can each approach making the field of science more equitable and inclusive? Does the N of 1 experiment, is it worthy of consideration?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think in a lot of cases, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We remember that there are actual researchers in the social sciences who are looking into these questions, and there are a lot of discussions that have happened into all of these different types of problems and how they're related to our productivity, how a lot of these have been set by colonialist histories, and how they have been informed by patriarchal and capitalistic views. And we have to remember, we have to ask the question, who is this benefiting, right? But also, whenever we do not actually have a straight answer to how we do this, I think from experience, I'll just give a few examples of interventions that we have done during my time in the industry in various different sectors. So, and that have worked. So when I was a PhD student, I was a representative at the Athena Swan team, which is an umbrella body in the UK looking at DEI in universities. So in Sussex, which is very much in Brighton, which is a queer capital of the UK, so it is almost much easier to do these kind of transformations there than elsewhere. You don't have to make as much of a case, I think, but it still is a very difficult job trying to put interventions in place for a large number of students and people together. So what we found during term time was that we just basically sent emails and asked what are the main concerns. And one of the concerns that came out was parking spaces for carers, as you mentioned, Kristen. And we found out that we don't have to do this all the time. So during term time, if for 1 to 2 hours during the times that people actually went to pick up their kids or drop off their kids, we could make those parking spaces for them, allotted to them during those specific times. The other people can use them around the other times. But this allowed these people to take away the barrier that they couldn't find a parking space, and so they are not able to do their care work as well as their work because they're losing extra time trying to find a parking space, and that can cause a lot of frustration. And this was a very simple tweak that seemed to work really well, and we got a lot of good feedback. And we didn't actually have to book off a big part of the parking space specifically for carers all times during the day. So we could make it multi-purpose. It was just one example. The other example was when I was when I was working in the space sector, and we presented the findings that, how women on average feel much colder in an office space because of the office temperature. So our manager asked us what is going to be a solution, because obviously we needed to also think a little bit about if we change the office temperature, again, a lot of other people are going to start feeling too hot. But we wanted to make a quick change that did not need a lot of big decisions because we were in a big building with lots of other offices in as well. So we got personal heaters. for the women on the team that needed it. Now remember that not every woman is going to be feeling the same way. So you can just send an email out and ask them to fill, or if you have a stock of personal heaters, then they can just go and collect one. That's another thing that I found works really well. We could just turn on the heater beneath us, and nobody else had to be affected by that. And the third one was in Scotland, menstrual products are free of charge, and they're provided to every office space. They're provided to every organization free of charge by the government. And once we started making all the toilets unisex, we started putting a lot of menstrual products in there, and we started putting baby changing rooms in the men's toilets as well. That changed things for a lot of other people. Soon, men could bring their children into work. We saw a lot of very nice culture coming up, and that set the precedent for how people behave with people when they're bringing children into work, just because people do behave better with men when they bring their children into work. And that set a precedent for the women as well, who were going to bring their children into work in the future. Again, men bringing their children into work made sure that their partners also got the same opportunity for success as they did. I think these are just really small changes. But again, we also made sure that unisex toilets were in place, and also single cubicle toilets, so that people who do not belong to the binary, who see themselves as a multiple different kinds of spectrum, who are trans, who are non-binary, can just go use whichever toilet they needed. And also people who wanted to just have a private single space of their own can also have that. And these again do not take a lot of work. You can just change around things. I think one of the things that has stuck with me is that I've always heard from partners that the men's toilets are generally not a safe space. Women usually see toilets as a safe space. We go there and it's fine. I sit on the toilet and just, can take a time out and just go in whenever needed. And I think we need to also start focusing on making a lot of spaces safe for everyone, even though it can be segregated, it can be non-segregated, depending on where in the world we are and what kind of different boundaries we need to put in place. But yeah, everyone needs to start tapping into that culture of care for themselves and for everyone else.
I love that. And I'm going to, but before we open for questions, I want to acknowledge the fact that many of you on this call today are working inside of systems where today's political discourse makes the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion rather fraught. And in some cases, your institutions are losing any funding for these types of programs and interventions. But some of what Sonali has described today, for example, providing heaters, space heaters to females in the labs, that's not a contentious move. That is not a political move. That is aligned with what Sonali said, which is around a culture of care. And so if you are a part of an institution where formalized efforts on diversity, equity, and inclusion are either under threat or are being defunded entirely, find ways to make those N of one changes in that culture of care. Find whatever is inside your sphere of influence that is a change you can make that is just for the betterment of the people on your team, in your group, in your class, in your lab, and so on. I think it's really important now more than ever to find ways to continue caring for the people around us who are marginalized, disadvantaged, recipients of bias and discrimination, when that may not be baked into the mandate of the institutions that we're a part of. So I just want to challenge you to do that.
I think if I'm just going to quickly say one more point, which is a very simple point. Again, I think in terms of height, discrimination, I think in lab spaces especially, it was one of my colleagues used to work on the Mars rover. She was from NASA, and then we were working together making the first quantum key distribution or instrument for space in the UK. I have always struggled with this, things being put on the top shelves, and then you need to go ask somebody who's really tall, or you need to get a staircase or something. She just came and asked, that is not going to work. I'm the team lead. This is going to go on my height level. And this is not difficult. We can put shelves at our height levels. We can put them lower. So I would just ask one more thing. When people are asking seemingly very stupid adjustments as well, let's not laugh. Let's just do the stupid adjustments, because it's not going to hurt anyone. And we can figure out how to maximize the other space later on. Yeah, just a very small tidbit that I remembered. Again, practical.
Thank you, Sonali. Appreciate it. Happy to open the chat as well as videos for folks to ask any questions that they have. Additionally, any questions that go into the chat that we don't have time to answer today, Sonali and I can connect and provide answers and send that back to the team there, and that can be shared with you. Anything that you all have curiosities about today's session, about other concepts more generally, but specifically perhaps around small disturbances, we welcome those questions now.
When I applied for my last job, I was in a few different interviews. I think one of the interviews were two women on the interviewing panel, and one of them was who I was going to report to, and the other woman was who would have reported to me. I actually really instantly, that made me feel really good, because that shows a culture of care, that you're caring who the manager of somebody who's already there in the company is going to be. These are very, very small tweaks, but they make an instant impression on the brain, and you remember that glowy feeling you had when you're suddenly going into a room and seeing people who look like you or who looked like you in the past.
Thanks for sharing that, Sonali. I know we've got a lot of folks on the call, and sometimes it takes a moment to consolidate a question. In another life, I was a school teacher, so I'm used to very long pauses as folks compose their questions, so take your time.
Yeah, we had a really good audience, so I'm being shy. I also wanted to apologize for our non-technical, non-scientific staff, because we did ask Kristen to craft this presentation mostly with the users meeting in mind. So early career staff, postdocs, like we wanted to be in line with the users meeting. So for those of you who are not scientists, it's not that we forgot about you. We wanted to make it for the users meeting.
I think all of these are applicable to almost everyone.
Yes.
Sometimes it might help to match scientists with non-scientists so that we can shake the ways we think, shake it about, and mingle brain hands together with other people who think slightly differently.
And that's another form of diversity, like different background in education.
Absolutely.
And jobs, and this is
two of them. One of the most amazing systems engineer that we had in our previous team used to work in supermarkets before he went to uni back again. He did his systems course. Then he tried applying to different places, but because he didn't have experience, couldn't get as much of a success rate. But then he just came and we said, yeah, why don't you stay for an internship? And he is one of the best minds I've seen. The other person who is one of the best coders, AI coders, that was in our team, came from a design background. She had a shop of design that she ran a business for many years, went back to school to do a conversion course, came back to do AI for space. And she is one of the best software developers I've seen.
You may have inspired me a question, but that could be a can of worm. Bias in AI. Do you have any insight about that?
I think it's going to become more and more apparent how much bias is there on the internet, and we are obviously training AI with a lot of biased data, but also we are the people who are training the AI. We don't have as much diversity as we would want in the kind of teams that we have. I think everyone needs to get involved. With ChatGPT being out there, generative AI models like ChatGPT, I would encourage, I'm sure all the physicists in the room are getting their hands dirty. If not, go ahead, have that. But I think what it has made, let's not forget that what it has made accessible to everyone is coding and making your own apps, making your own software, reducing those barriers down yourself, that it has made accessible. All people need to learn right now is a very simple thing. How do you basically copy and paste a simple Python code and run it yourself? You don't even need to write it. Ask ChatGPT, write this thing, And then you need to just understand what environment you need to set up on your laptop so that you can run that code and make your own apps. You can make your own applications. You can take away the bias and grant processes, for example, by, it's going to make it more accessible for people with non-English backgrounds, for example, to be matching the levels or the kind of bias in the processes that we're expecting people to write in. So what my partner said, it's made writing very accessible to him, so he felt very liberated. Obviously, we must remember there's a big part of the population who does not have, who are going to lose out a lot because of this kind of technology. And we need to remember that technology is something we need to build for people. We shouldn't leave people behind. We're not very good at that yet. So I think lots of work to be done there, because these are not obviously very easy problems to solve.
And I think for those of you who, as Fanny mentioned, are not scientists, the problems that we see emerge where certain people and groups are discriminated against and face unequal outcomes, it's representative of the gap that very often exists between decision makers and those who the decisions are intended to impact. The designers, the coders, the people who inform the algorithms, and the many, many, many different people and groups that they're intended to serve. And your own daily work and decision-making, there will be that gap between you, the decisions you're making, and those your decisions are intended to serve. Anytime you have the opportunity to close that gap, to bring together those voices, the decisions you're making are going to be better. They're going to be less biased. They're going to be more inclusive. They're going to be more equitable. So that's just a distillation to kind of a bit of a simple framework, closing the gap between decision makers and those who are impacted by decisions.
I see Marian put a note about it's hard to remember all of the obstacle you have to overcome. I know my mother is left-handed, and it's amazing how many things are not designed for left-handed people. And she was actually from that generation where they force you to write with the right hand. So it's funny to see her change hand depending on what she does, because she had to learn to adapt to, like, even canopreneur, not typically made for left-handed. Like, it's little things like this. I see there are also comment in there.
I did want to get back to Kamlesh's point. I wanted to highlight that in India, we have the highest number. India is the leader in terms of how many women are there in higher education. Nowhere in the world comes close to that. So I think it's very important to be shaking up the words that we use, like developing nations and developed nations, because through our journeys, we're not seeing these are colonial words. We need to retire them. And we need to understand that we can learn from, different kind of countries and different kind of communities. One of the questions I was asked as a panel in the space sector once was, what can the Indian space sector learn from the UK space sector? And that was very mind-boggling, because the UK space sector is very young. It's 10 years old, and we are building some of the first satellites there. The Indian space sector is quite fast. It's been there for a long time. Half of the world basically, depends on Indian launch vehicles to put their satellites up in space, either India or Russia or the US. So these are questions, again, that we need to remember that are very colonial. The language we use are very remnant of that kind of past. Yeah, and a lot of the statistics on South Asians in the US, I do not know. In the UK, I do know, and it's just kind of representative of, in the UK, one of the things I do kind of come across very much, that people look at the underdeveloped parts of, let's say, Glasgow, and think that, oh, there's no Indian and Pakistanis here. But a lot of the time, Indians and Pakistanis usually have to prove their worth, and are usually doctors or something to be able to come into a system such as the UK. They are quite highly skilled just because of how the visa process works. Again, that's not representative of every single place. But yeah, a lot of these kind of statistics are there. And I think we can all play a part in inculcating those statistics in places where we want other people to have visibility of them.
Well, thank you. We're 2 minutes past the hour, so that was amazing, like always. We hope you guys enjoyed that conversation. We had really good attendance. I'm happy. And we hope we can have Kristen another time at Oregon, because now she's a recurring guest. And thank you to Sonali for your insight. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks very much, Fanny. Thanks,
Yeah.
Kristen, for the invitation.
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.